Okay, I think we're going to begin. Thank you for joining us today. We're talking about an extremely important topic, and that is trauma-informed care. We're so lucky to have a guest with us today, someone who I am so proud to call an acquaintance, a friend, Dr. Laura McGuire. She's the CEO of the National Center for Equity and Agency. They've created the first legal certification training specifically for the legal space. So legal professionals being trained in trauma-informed care. They also have really pushed forward our company in a lot of ways, and something that I want to share with as many people as possible. So Laura, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I always love these conversations with you and Milestone.
The very first thing I'm going to ask you to do is, can you define briefly, you are a PhD, I'm an attorney, we love working in definitions. What is trauma-informed care, especially within this context?
Yes. So there's three main points I love to kind of connect to when discussing what does this look like, again, very succinctly, because we could, write pages and pages about what trauma-informed care looks like and is. But to make it really clear and concise, number one, it's understanding the depth and breadth of trauma in the world around us, right? Not thinking of trauma as a very separate niche issue that only a few people experience, but as something that is really prevalent and present in so many people's lives. And then with that knowledge, we move on to the way that we look at the world shifting and seeing every single person that we interact with, whether it's a colleague, the person giving us our coffee, or someone coming in for a consultation, as a potential survivor. And so we don't wait for them to disclose their trauma to us. We give everyone that same kind of empathy and patience and kindness. And lastly, and you'll hear this pretty much in any book or podcast or documentary about trauma-informed care, it's really then making this cognitive shift internally from asking ourselves, why is this person like this? Why are they distracted? Why can't they follow through with things? Why are they breaking down and crying? Why are they explosively angry? And instead of putting that why label on them, internally asking ourselves, I wonder what happened, and I wonder how I can support them, because clearly there's a story behind that reaction.
And I mean, in my mind, that's something that a lot of attorneys, especially litigators, do naturally. Like something where you have to read the jury and understand where their pressure points are. That's sort of like reptilian language, but that's language given, right? Or you're sort of analyzing a client and thinking, is this going to be a quote unquote problem client? Which is a lot of language that I've heard in my years, both litigating and working in this context. Do you have any sort of magic tips, any sort of solutionary based real world experience that you've seen sort of take shape within the legal context as far as providing trauma-informed care and working with maybe those more difficult problem clients when it comes to the space?
Absolutely, yes. And I think so much of it is people think they're good at analyzing people or situations, but they don't know what they don't know. And I also have seen where people maybe get training from being in the legal sphere or police work or military work, where they were told that certain things invalidate credibility, or certain things are, someone just being difficult. And really, if they understood what was going on cognitively, some of the foundational neuroscience, you don't have to be a professional to understand those basic components. What they learn is, what they've been taught is something they should dismiss, or an area to have concerns around fraud, et cetera, is actually really well aligned with a trauma response, the way someone processes chronic stress and traumatic experience. And when they have that understanding, it's this huge light bulb moment of, oh my goodness, I've been labeling people, I've been discrediting people, I've been saying, there's no way they can remember something after I asked them one time, or that I can help them to calm down when they seem so scattered and overwhelmed. But with that knowledge base, all these micro shifts happen that lead to really big macro changes, and that transmits into every area of their practice.
Could you sort of, I know that this is something you could lecture on, so, but just briefly kind of talk into some of that neuroscience cognitive response. I mean, I know like attorneys, they love the hard science answers, right? Like we love the black and white if we can get it, right? And so like when you say there's a specific neuroscience response to trauma, what are you actually referencing?
Yeah, so of course, right, there are huge books, libraries written about this stuff if you want to really like geek out about it. But the three things I always try to explain to, again, people who are dealing with clients in crisis on a regular basis is, number one, the area of the brain that really enlarges during a trauma response or being reminded of a traumatic experience is the amygdala, which is our fear response area. And that's why you can't just tell someone to calm down, right? You can't just say, well, that was in the past and you should be over it by now. The amygdala is not good at knowing that. It knows if I sense any sort of danger like what I've previously experienced, I'm going to have that same response to try to protect myself. And part of that is hypervigilance, where we can also perceive when we're in that fearful state, anyone as a potential source of additional harm. And so why are some people so combative, even though we're here to help them? That can be one of the reasons. The other areas of the brain that really shrink down are the areas we so want to be functioning. And trust me, the survivor wants that too, and it's hard. And that's things like our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that makes decisions, that keeps us calm and regulated, that allows us to navigate options, all different things that are really crucial when talking to an attorney or testifying. And then the other part that really shrinks down, which is so key to this credibility piece, is the hippocampus, which is one of our main areas that we keep memory. And so the hippocampus knows that traumatic memory is really hard when it comes to day-to-day functioning after, and it often really scatters those memories, especially when it experiences stress again. So thinking about like a deposition, someone goes in, they're in a hostile environment being, interrogated by someone who isn't on their side, and it's really hard for them to recall things they might have been easily able to express in a different environment where they felt safer. And so it's having that understanding that really helps us to think differently about what we're observing, and again, really think through what are the support things I can put in place to help counteract some of those natural experiences.
And I think immediately to like when we first started doing these trainings years ago, how we switched our beginning of our settlement planning conversations, beginning of our payment conversations direct to clients, instead of asking why you're receiving these funds, how much of these funds are you receiving, any sort of those like really beginning questions to a financial planning conversation, and really kind of putting that on its head, because you don't want to re-traumatize someone with your first question. Immediately it turns off their memory and their reasoning, and all of a sudden you're asking them to reason around large financial sums and have a memory of the plan that they had going forward. Instead we can ask much softer questions or use a different form of language or communication to build a level of trust. I wanted to just kind of talk about communicating a little bit, kind of talking to clients. Are there any sort of best practices that you see as far as communication technique goes, specifically with survivor clients, but generally with all clients, as we know anyone we're interacting with may be someone experiencing trauma?
Yes, absolutely. And you make such a good point there, because we're getting more and more research about litigation trauma. The fact that any litigative experience is traumatic in and of itself, separate from the thing that is bringing you there. So that's really important to point out. But yes, there's a lot of communication techniques that, again, people often think I'm conveying this very clearly. I'm a great communicator, right? But different skills are called in at different times, and maybe we don't think about that as much as we could. So things like you just mentioned, building trust. Before we go into, here's what we need to go through today. Let me check these boxes on the questions I need to ask you. you have to build rapport. You have to have that foundation. Greet them as a person, learn about who they are, create a neutral environment of, I'm a person, you're a person, let's have a foundation of trust, right? Because if we have that foundation, and I also bring that into every conversation moving forward, I ask about how your kid's school is going. I remember that you had a special event coming up, and I bring that into an email or a text or a phone call or a meeting in the future. That allows me as the survivor or client to relax, to have that sense of safety. And that facilitates all different kinds of communication that are effective. The other thing is monitoring in ourselves our own nervous system and what we're conveying. So noticing in our voice, does our voice sound warm and welcoming? Or are we kind of in autopilot and you're the 20th person I've talked to today and they kind of sound like a robot right now? And I'm just, again, you can tell I'm reading from a list of questions. And also even in our body language, relaxing our muscles, making sure we have expressions on our faces that show I'm excited to engage with you. And that can sound so simplistic and you think everybody does that, but it's so often missed.
And one of the things I just want to highlight is these are all things that, we generally know, right? We know how to be nice as people. But like anything, trauma-informed is a practice. It's something that you work towards, right? And it's something that certainly isn't perfected. I make mistakes every day, just like everyone else. But something that we can definitely practice and work towards in a way where we can be better tomorrow than we were today, sort of thing. And no one's ever going to be the fully evolved state of perfection when it comes to this. With that being said, I know that you created the first legal certification training. Can you sort of talk a little bit about doing those trainings? I know we've done them in the settlement planning and disbursement-based context, but how does that sort of work with a law firm?
Yeah, so right, my firm, the National Center for Equity and Agency, created the first trauma-informed certification directly for legal professionals because a lot of people have gotten kind of 101 information and they're feeling good about that, but they want to, one, differentiate themselves further, and two, walk through some more of these examples of practical application. So that's what we really do in our time together in the certification framework and curriculum. So that is, yes, really focusing on, again, day-to-day, forward-facing with clients, and also internally, what does this really look like in those realities? We give examples of emails that are not so trauma-informed, but very common, versus one that is more conscious of this. And we practice looking at case studies, looking at examples of things that can commonly come up. And again, with this additional information, how do we view something that could be seen as rudimentary differently? And we've seen these transformations where people really do start to see and adjust things, and that filters down to client retention, referrals increasing, but also retention internally of their own team members, their own employees, who are now starting to receive a different approach and are able to manage their own secondary trauma differently.
And I can just highlight that within the Milestone experience, right? So we started doing these trainings and realizing that, mailing a check to a client, mailing out packets to clients, it didn't provide the right communication tools, specifically for survivors, but really for all clients, in that they wanted to know clear expectations. In order to have trust, you have to have clear expectation. And so the idea was, well, what if we created this through a digital means? What if we were able to pay people faster? What if we were able to not leave it up to 2 weeks in the USPS process and instead actually just had people go on and sign a DocuSign? And in doing so, be able to provide portals with direct information to the claimants. And what if we were able to word those in a certain way and have someone help us word those to make sure that it's reaching as much people as possible? I mean, just recently, we've changed the language on the majority of our client communications to be at a reading level that is, lower than expected amongst attorneys, but one where people aren't going to be confused. And maybe it might take a few more words, or maybe you have to embed videos in order to keep people attuned to what's going on. But at the same time, you're reaching more people. And those are something that came directly out of doing trauma-informed care trainings when thinking, how can we best reach the population we're trying to serve? You mentioned secondary traumas. That's something I kind of want to talk on as well. Anyone who works in a legal profession is dealing with clients on a regular basis has some form of secondary trauma. I go back to my days of doing pro bono legal work and seeing people who are in really difficult situations. Like working at a debt clinic, you see all sorts of folks who are at all points of life, and it's really hard not to bring a lot of those troubles home. Can you sort of talk about doing secondary trauma trainings with people and sort of the results you've seen?
Yes, definitely. So, that is one of the things that we got as early feedback when we were saying, okay, if we create trainings, much less a certification program, what are the key components that we really want to make sure are built in there? And a huge part of that was, okay, we love all this stuff for what we're giving to people, but we also have to receive it. And, as a professional who has worked with a lot of different spaces that involve interacting with situations that are chronically traumatic and people are experiencing even re-victimization, and you're there to support them, I know how often it is that you get this information, but you don't get to experience it for yourself, right? Your supervisors and your colleagues are maybe not being trauma informed with you, and yet you're told, act this way, think this way when interacting with the public. So that's something we really spend a good part of our second day of training on is, what is secondary trauma? How does it show up? Common misconceptions, huge one, especially for attorneys, is I used to get stressed. I used to be taking this home, but now I feel nothing. I've gotten over it. And then understanding, no, there's still that cumulative stress load that your body and brain is taking on, but you might be numbing out to it because there's so much of it at this point. And we see people 20, 50 years into their career having health conditions because that has never been addressed. So we talk about that. We talk about what are some research-based tools that help build resiliency and process that stress cycle, because we want people to have sustainable careers, right? We want them to love this work and be amazing at what they do and be able to do it long term without getting to that place of being numb or burning out or having that kind of jaded perspective, because then that's not going to serve their clients, their families, themselves, or their community.
Yeah. I want to ask a little bit about confidentiality. It's one of the tenets of the legal profession, right? It's something that we all practice on a daily basis. How does that sort of relate to trauma-informed?
So confidentiality is so huge. It's one of the reasons that people don't come forward or they don't get support in different ways, is this fear of, this is so personal, this is so private, this is really going to be a major exposure for me mentally, maybe even physically, socially, economically, if I'm telling this or if other people find out. And so making sure that survivors understand, here's the processes we've put in place. And like you said, making it in very simplistic language is so vital, because that really takes down one of those major barriers in accessing those kinds of resources and support. But I think a lot of times we have processes and practices in place that don't honor that, don't acknowledge that, or even if we do, we haven't explained that to the potential clients. And so making sure that communication is clear and that there is all of that processes that are really solid across the board, across the organization, across the firm, is going to be one of the things that, again, either makes you someone that victims and survivors want to reach out to and connect with, or that they see an additional barrier to working with.
And I just think to this one survivor client that I was once aware of, was working with a law firm, and they found out that law firm had a case management file on them, right? And that people within the law firm could view that case management file and see the notes and documents within it. And no one had taken the time to sit down with that client at the very first meeting and explain the legal concept of confidentiality, where everyone at this firm is on your team. Everyone on this firm has the same sworn promise that what happens here has to stay here, and that it legally it cannot go outside of this context. I've seen it applied in all sorts of practical manners where you don't CC people on emails, right? They interact with one point of contact at the firm, or maybe two, but they definitely have to meet those people in person and shake their hand. If this is someone who isn't in person and shaking hands, if you're running more of like a digital or national law firm, at least it's a phone call, right? It's somebody that they know is receiving their information, especially if it's some sort of medical record or some sort of personal experience. That stuff's really sensitive. And I think that so often as attorneys, there's so much information that we know that we forget that our attorneys don't, that our clients don't. So things like, trying to explain to people that everything that you put into this, so I think of our own pathway portal, right? We're doing mass tort disbursement. All the information that's recorded here is kept confidential. All the security here is SOC 2, which is the highest level of security that we can provide. Being able to do that and alert the clients of that makes them more confident in the process. And all of a sudden you see the client retention boosting. All of a sudden you see increased responsiveness, and you're not wasting staff time sending 5 emails to the same person trying to reach them, because that person thinks of you as in their corner. They want to respond to you. They're looking forward to the message. And that's something that I've practically seen. I know you did a training with prominent AAJ attorney in person not too long ago, and that's something that their firm reported back, was that after doing that training, they're seeing that their staff's better able to work with survivor clients. And so I won't mention names and the like, but something I just wanted to speak to. I want to talk also about the ability to reschedule. Something that I know attorneys find is very, very difficult, but oftentimes when working with clients who, when they trigger a trauma response, the idea that, well, you can come back another time, or we can do this at a different point. Can you sort of talk about that a little bit?
Yes, definitely. So there's a couple of layers to that. Like we talked about with even memory and being able to answer questions or make a decision. We might say, well, we said we were going to meet today, but something might have come up for that person. Or again, this is a conversation that is brought up so much for them. Even if we think, but I'm here to help and this is positive, it might not have that feeling for the individual. And so they might say, here's what I can tell you right now, but I need to sit with this. I need to talk to my therapist about this. I need to be at home in an environment where I feel really safe and my brain can relax, and I can give you information that I might not be able to when we're face-to-face in a kind of sterile office environment. Another thing that can come up with rescheduling is we might have availability and think, you know what, I'm just gonna hop on a call. I need to reach out to this person anyway. And we think, I'm catching them off guard, but I'm sure we'll be fine. Nothing too sensitive will be discussed here. But for that person, even seeing our number or our name on their phone can be a very triggering experience, right? This is recalling why they connected with us, and that can be really challenging. So they might start to shut down, or they might be in an environment where there's other people who can overhear that conversation that they really don't want to know or have them know what happened. And even if we set up a meeting, and this is really a big thing that I always try to hit home, even if we've already set up that time, again, maybe to be on the phone with someone, always affirm that consent. You said this was a good time for you. You said yes to this appointment, but is it still? Because maybe your boss just walked in your office, or maybe your child just ran up to you and you need to reschedule, or we need to wait a few moments. And making sure that they have the understanding that you are flexible and adaptive to those needs is going to create that different kind of relationship.
100%. I mean, and part of what you're talking about too, all this stuff always ties into one another, but I'm always thinking of, like, I'm always yelling at attorneys that, especially in the mass tort space, that work with survivors, like, stop mailing checks to their houses. I mean, just the practical real world example of, you have adult children and they come into the house and they open your mail, and they see a settlement check that has X, Y, and Z defendant's name on it, and all of a sudden they're wondering why is dad getting a check from Boy Scouts for America, right? And then they go and they Google it, and they're like, oh my gosh, and that's how we're going to inform the people closest to us that we've been through these types of experiences. That's unacceptable, right? And so trying to think of on every little information point, how we can preserve that confidentiality, how we can have these discussions with clients, so we can give them the space to be going through what they're living through.
Well,
another thing we've talked about.
I was just going to say, on that note, a really important thing to point out is, right, someone might say, actually, my home mailing that check feels safer because I share the bank account with my child or my spouse, and I don't want them to maybe know all this. I have something separate for that, right? It really all comes down to the fact that trauma is always about taking away power and control and choice as part of that from the individual. Any kind of trauma, from a car accident to an assault. And so as professionals in this space, that is always our ultimate goal, is to give that back in any way that we possibly can. What works best for you? How do we want to navigate this? Let's explore those options together, right? Because it's not even thinking, well, I'm assuming this is best for you, but really making sure they have the power and control over what happens next.
But next to those options also needs to be the clear expectation, right? So that there's the understanding, because I've seen this backfire as well, where I've seen the context where every option is given, but without a clear timeline or a clear understanding, right? And so when discussing those legal options, I mean, that's something that is paramount, right? If you're going to go this path or this path, this is what will likely happen, this is what will likely happen. These are the expectations to be given, but you can make that choice.
And I think that's one of the things that lawyers forget about a lot, because they know the what ifs, the trajectories, and they assume that other people have some kind of frame of reference for that. And again, I wrote 2 books about consent and trauma, right? And so consent is so multi-layered and vital, and one of the key components is a clear understanding, that someone understands the full gamut, a holistic perspective on what they're agreeing or not agreeing to.
So we're reaching the end of a half hour. I want to open this up to questions. So in the questions tab on the right side of your screen, if anyone has questions, please ask them. Laura and I could literally talk all day, so we're going to keep doing that. And I have a few more of my own. So if it takes a little while for questions to come in, that's fine. If you do want to ask questions, that's even better. So happy to make this an open conversation, or just to keep on riffing. We'll keep going for another 10 minutes or so. Laura, I want to talk about the future. What do you see happening in the legal space as far as trauma-informed care? I mean, I know, like, the idea of you don't CC people on emails, or you keep client communications, warm and fuzzy, but also precise with clear expectation. Like, those are things that we all know. What are sort of some of those future steps you see people taking in the space, or sort of happening around trauma-informed care?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I hope is that every person who is currently practicing, but especially people who are coming into this field, who are graduating from law school, have this foundational knowledge, right? So much of what's been done in the past has been really counteractive to what people need. And, it's the go-to answer is, well, it's how it's always been done. Well, this is just how we've always thought about it. And so I would love to see everybody get at least some education on that before they go out and are practicing. My other big hope is that they can find jobs that, again, are trauma-informed spaces to be employed, that they are honored as human beings themselves with multifaceted needs and experiences, and that they're really supported in that so they can have these amazing careers. And, the reason I created the certification from the start initially was it was so hard for me to find someone who had these kinds of practices in place. And my hope is that we create this network of people who have this certification or have this very high level of commitment, and that designate themselves that way so that survivors can connect with them. right? So often we are asking our therapists, our victim advocates, do you know anyone who you recommend? And it's kind of crickets. It's like, well, maybe I've heard this person's okay, but not, yes, I know this individual is committed to trauma-informed care, and this is what that looks like. And so that is my hope, is that we create that world where people are going into this with that knowledge, environments are supporting them in that practice, and then clients are able to access those professionals quickly and effectively.
And one of the things that I want to highlight too is a lot of the time I hear the sort of retort to trauma-informed care as it not being being too like soft or too pie in the sky or too ethereal or whatever the right word is. I don't know. But you know, you see hardened trial attorneys kind of looking down their nose at it, being like, I know how to read the room. One of the things that I like to always highlight is the dollars and cents behind this when you're operating a business. I mean, if you're talking about increased staff retention, increased client retention, increased client satisfaction, you know, decreased wasted time just sending emails into the abyss and your client is not responding to you. These are the sort of practices that you don't want your business to go without, because if your business has them, you're going to see increased participation both by your own staff and by your clients. And it's something that, you know, we've lived firsthand at Milestone. And so like I can attest to that, right? And I know it's not specifically a law firm, but it's within the legal space. It's working with the same people. Is there any other sort of like argument that you give to, let's say it's the, you know, the hard-nosed trial attorney who's kind of looking down their nose at these concepts or ideas?
Yeah, no, of course, we see that a lot, not just in the legal space, in many different professions, right? And it's interesting because we've focused creating these programs for the spaces that don't traditionally have them, right? Teachers and therapists have had this kind of training for decades, and many other areas have not. So we will often get that pushback. And I think, yes, hitting home that it does impact their bottom line. Turnover and onboarding is incredibly expensive. And especially with younger attorneys coming in, they are looking for environments that understand this, acknowledge this, and honor it. And clients are as well. People will often have to leave, or if they even are retained, but they won't be responsive. They won't be the kind of, you know, witness on the stand that you're hoping for. They won't follow through with using you if something comes up in the future, if they don't feel that they were really heard and seen. Right? If they think I was just another number, it was so hard to get anyone to come back and give me follow-up information, or when I was telling my story, it was like I was reading someone the phone book. I know I've experienced that. I know so many other survivors have, right? You feel like I am telling you the deepest, darkest part of myself, and you're just, and then going on to your next question. And also referrals are huge, right? We get so much of our business from other people saying, this person stood out. They cared about me in a different way. And those changes are so small. Other than training and refreshers, it's not an overhead cost, right? You're not downloading software or putting in a new appliance. And so it's really cost effective. But I think there can be sometimes fear of maybe even acknowledging that things could have been different. I hear a lot of times from people who've been in the fields for many decades, well, no one treated me like this, or I didn't get that when I was struggling. And so some of that resistance can also be feeling like there's an inequity with that. But we want to focus on, yes, acknowledging you could have gotten more support, and we want to make the future different for that reason.
Laura, thank you so much. I want to plug that at the end of June 29th and 30th, that you're doing what you refer to as your individual signups training, right? So people, if your organization isn't doing this training, but you still want to do it, you can go and do an in-person training with Dr. McGuire, specifically on these topics. And you can go and get certified on an individual basis. It doesn't have to be as part of your broader firm. That's coming up. That's in about a month and a half. Do you want to talk about that just for like 1 or 2 minutes, and then I have one more question, and then we'll close.
Sure. So most of the time when we go out and do certifications, they are on our client's schedule. So they will pick the time and location, and we go out to them and bring all the training supplies and everything. And so that's great because we're working around their needs, but sometimes people don't have a group to host that. And so once a year, we try to do an open session, and that's what's coming up in June. It's being hosted by Dominican University in Illinois, where individuals or small groups of people can get together, take the certification. And as part of the certification, and it's important to point out, you're not just going for the training itself, you also get ongoing support over the years that you're certified through one-on-one coaching. So as situations arise, you will continue to get support around that.
Awesome. For those who've hung on till the end, do you have any sort of last practical tips? I can think of a few you've told me in the past that haven't really come up yet. Can you maybe give us like 1 or 2 final little practical tips that work?
So I think practical tips are really thinking through, again, how somebody is going to be receiving any kind of communication that you have. Thinking about how that email is going to be read, making sure we address people by their names. That's so small, but so often overlooked. And I think also really making sure that we are investing in our own well-being and addressing our own trauma. I think a lot of people also get into this work because we've been through stuff and we want to make a change, but that's really easy to burn out and be overwhelmed by. So that's why one of the things that we sign on our code of ethics is that I will be committed to addressing my own trauma and building my own resiliency and having a self-care plan for that. So making sure that that becomes part of the culture at your firm or among your colleagues and in professional organizations. I think, again, talking about the future, that really is going to be the future of how we change these things in any of these fields.
Awesome. So thank you, Dr. McGuire. Thanks for being with us today. If people have questions, you can always email us. We'll send a recorded link of this if you have partners that you want to participate in something like this or to just have a little bit more knowledge. Please feel free to share it. Spread the word around. I mean, this is, it's a revolution within the practice of law that sort of happened in every other profession about 25 years ago. And we're always a little bit late to things, seemingly. So let's not be too late, right? Thank you everyone for being on today, and I'll talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.